Hello, everyone, and welcome to Finding Value Through Sourcing. My name is Daniel Patterson, and I'm an application engineer at aPriori. I'm also joined by Nikita Shah, a senior customer success manager. So, with that, I will hand it off to Nikita, and let's get started.
Thanks, Dan. So today we're going to talk first about manufacturing simulation for sourcing, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Dan, who's going to do a demonstration of the aPriori software. And lastly, we'll talk about implementing aPriori. At the end, we actually will have plenty of time for questions and answers. So definitely be thinking through of questions throughout the session, and we'll likely have a good chance to get them answered. So understanding and managing cost of goods sold is really an important aspect to managing a business. The COVID-19 pandemic has created workforce disruptions that have affected OEMs across the board. So now more than ever, it's important to manage the supply chain. Some of the frequent challenges that we see include identifying supply chain risks and holding negotiations with enough detail, or even understanding which parts to get started with. It's critical to overcome these challenges by automating sourcing processes with manufacturing insights. Many of our customers today are using aPriori to create bid packages that are more aligned with supplier capabilities. They're facilitating fact-based negotiations and even completely collaborating with suppliers so that instead of negotiating on an individual part or assembly, they're negotiating on a digital factory. So during the session today, consider how leveraging aPriori can be used within your organization to reduce supply chain risks and promote cost savings. So before we focus solely on sourcing, I wanted to go through where should cost and manufacturing simulation can be used throughout an organization. We see manufacturing simulation used in multiple spaces across an organization. For example, in R&D, they can use it to assess early concept costs, evaluate alternatives, and develop new high-margin products. NPI or design can use aPriori or should cost estimates for design to cost targets, forecasting new product costs, and reducing time to market by minimizing cycles. Cost engineering is typically staffed by subject matter experts who utilize their manufacturing knowledge to generate a robust should cost estimate. Sourcing can use should cost analyses to perform outlier analysis and analyze a greater percent of spend in a more efficient manner. Manufacturing can utilize should costs for time standard developments, capital justification, make versus buy analysis, or requests for quote responses. And lastly, value engineering can adopt should cost to reduce current product costs, complete costing of engineering changes, VAVE opportunity identification, or improving costs for the next program. The concept and skills of should cost, though, are relatable across each of these primary use cases. So why should cost? Ultimately, should cost within the sourcing use case empowers an organization to change the discussion. The iceberg here is a pretty strong visual representation of the negotiation process. Every buyer sees opportunity to reduce quote through negotiation, and in most parts, suppliers expect it. It's a part of the process. But with should cost, we open up the conversation to a much larger opportunity. Think of should cost as an additional quote from a supplier, which enables fact-based negotiation. You're too high, and this is why. Or here are my assumptions to expected cost. Let's talk about what considerations might be incorrect. You could focus on things like cycle time, machine selection, current manufacturing processes, material utilization, labor, and overhead rates. These are all now elements of the negotiation conversation. Hidden below the surface of the water, the iceberg potentially contains non-optimal manufacturing processes, low value cost drivers, hidden margin, or even misinterpreted design specifications. Having should cost empowers the buyer to be in an equal position at the negotiation table. Additionally, a product's design greatly affects how much it'll cost to produce. The geometry of the part, material selections, tolerances, surface finishes, and a number of other attributes determine what processes will be used in manufacturing. So let's now talk about an example from one of our customers. They had a significant gap between the should cost and supplier quote, and they couldn't understand what the driver of the cost was from the supplier side. Upon discussion with the supplier, it was pointed out that the drawing, not the CAD file, contained a specification which the supplier was including in the manufacturing cost. They did an internal review, and the specification requirement could not be validated at all by engineering. No
I'm
one
Mr.
could
Lisa.
assess what or why elimination of that specification from that internal document ended up saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Was there a question? Or okay. So let's look further below the iceberg surface and focus on differentiation between should cost and quoted cost. It's beneficial to understand the drivers of cost which a supplier might incur and needs to recoup via the purchase order. So we've already established should cost and profit, but next is variation amongst suppliers, which is to be expected. No two suppliers have identical cost structures. Lastly, variation is driven by such items such as machine capacity, good part yield, and deployed labor. In an idealistic world, this would close the variation and we would arrive at a quoted cost. But the reality is there are additional cost drivers that impact or cost driver impacts that need to be understood as part of the overall analysis. So, for example, supply chain and purchasing cost drivers. The supply chain is set up by the purchasing group, which includes interplant logistics and affects product costs. Marketing cost drivers. So, the annual production of a part in the life of the product line can have a powerful effect on the manufacturing processes used, suppliers selected, and whether to use capital investment to reduce the variable costs of production. Manufacturing cost drivers. These are capabilities of a given factory, including process routings, tooling, speeds and feed, and batch sizes. They all affect the product's true economic cost. At the lowest level, you can fully engage the supplier to discuss the variation between should cost and the supplier quote. This analysis is more than just a comparison of the absolute values, but rather the underlying cost drivers of each element. The elements outlined on the slide here are things that you can have discussions on. So for example, you can have discussions on material cost management, labor cost management, cycle time, burden cost, SG&A and profit, as well as engineering change cost management. There's 4 steps you can really take to engage the supplier. So first, start by asking the right questions. Then make comparisons to appropriate data. You can then identify cost reduction opportunities or update your data so that it's more reflective of the supplier's environment. And lastly, you can negotiate. So I'll go over this technique for burden cost. For example, you may want to first start with questions such as, do you have a blended burden rate, or do you apply rates by work cell or cost center? What are the burden rates per operation? Do you apply burden rates over machine hours or labor hours? Or are direct labor costs included within the burden rate? Once you have that information, make comparisons. So check for accuracy, maybe visit the plant or ask the plant controller. Observe the equipment and the infrastructure within the facility. Maybe the plant is utilized, or maybe there's a non-productive space. Then look competitively. What are your other suppliers saying? Maybe even check the internet and other internal libraries. And lastly, look at annualized overhead costs. Does it seem reasonable for what they're doing? Next, you want to look for opportunities for reduction or identify profit if there's profit enhancement. Maybe the supplier is overstating the overhead rate and the standard hours. Maybe they're assuming low utilization of the equipment or applying a blended rate instead of applying a rate per operation. And then lastly, negotiate based on your findings or the supplier's response. This methodology can be engaged across the quotation for each line item. Using this should cost as an unbiased quote fosters an open discussion, placing the buyer in a stronger position. Having should cost provides two primary outcomes. First, it's an educational tool that the sourcing professionals, especially those with limited manufacturing experience, can obtain a stronger knowledge of what they are buying. And secondly, suppliers realize that should cost has been adopted by the OEM and that they need to have the supporting detail to validate a quote in comparison to the should cost. We've talked a lot today about fact-based negotiation. However, with aPriori, there are other common sourcing analyses that we see, which include outlier analysis and looking at alternative routings, materials, and machines. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan now, who's going to do a demonstration of the aPriori software and what some of these analyses can look like.
Okay, thank you, Nikita. And let me just pull up my screen. So let me know, Nikita, is my screen coming through?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I'll walk you through the steps of generating a cost estimate with aPriori, the inputs that were required, and then walk you through analyzing the data that comes out of aPriori. So to generate a cost estimate with aPriori, all you need is the CAD file. You don't need CAD installed on your system or need to know how to use CAD. You just need the ability to point to that CAD file to generate a cost estimate. So I've gone ahead and pointed to this trim clip. I'll go ahead and answer a few basic questions about the part. The first question is, what's my primary method of manufacturing this part? I need to tell aPriori if this is a sheet metal component or a casting or a plastic component, and I can easily do trade-off scenarios as well. I can look at this across process groups. So I'll say sheet metal, and then I'll select the digital factory that I'd like to use to manufacture this component in. We have the world broken out into 79 different regions. You'll see regions in the US, Europe, Asia, Africa, and from those regional data libraries, we're pulling in the labor rates, the overhead rates associated with manufacturing in that region. This data gets updated every 90 days. If you do happen to know the rates that your suppliers are charging you, you can easily create a digital factory that represents their capabilities and their rates. So I'll say, for example, aPriori USA Southeast. I'll come in here, then I'll select my material. I'll say, let's say this one's going to be a stainless steel 316. We'll pull in not only the unit cost for that material, but also the manufacturing parameters. We'll understand the strength of the material, how the material forms, all of that automatically. And then we'll finally say how many of these parts we want to make. We'll say 25,000 of these for 5 years. So at this point, aPriori has everything it needs to generate a cost estimate. So I'll go ahead and click cost. And what you'll see now is it's going through a geometry analysis. So it's extracting what we call geometric cost drivers. So those are the forms, the bins, each individual feature of the part. Once it has those features, it then runs them through our cost models. So right now it's going through the different sheet metal processes. It's looking to decide, is this a laser part? Is this a plasma part? Is this a stage tool or progressive die? And then it will come back with that lowest cost feasible routing. So aPriori's come back with our progressive die. We picked that as the lowest cost option. We have 8 stages. And if we look back at our routing, we can see the different options here. 37 cents for our progressive die. Our stage tool came in at 63 cents. And then we had some processes, water jet, we just couldn't produce all the features. So we had a warning over here saying we couldn't complete the forms. So those were partial costs. If I come over into my cost summary, I can see the full detail of cost. I have just about a cent of material cost, 2 cents of labor, 3 cents of direct overhead. My biggest charge, though, is $35,000 for producing this tooling. And keep in mind, we're only running this for $25,000 for 5 years. So we have 29 cents of amortized tooling per part. So our piece part cost is only 8 cents, but 29 cents for that tooling. If I come over and look, you can actually see how aPriori's done a full bottoms up calculation. So we've taken this part, we've automatically flattened this out. We understood how the material stretches and forms. We have that flattened blank. And then we actually went through and nested this out all automatically. So we're understanding the pitch and width of the coil. All of this has been applied automatically without the user having to make a single selection. So at this point, I could take this part and I could use these results, or let's say, for example, we want to move this part to, let's pick a region in China. So let's move this to the Hangzhou region of China, for example. I'll make a change here to my region. I'll select that as my new digital factory, and then we'll up our annual volume. So we're looking to do 250,000 now. So I'll recost this. aPriori will reanalyze this model and come back with an updated cost. During this analysis, it'll also look at that tool life. So it'll understand, will one tool be sufficient to make these 1.25 million parts? Or do we need additional tools here? aPriori will do this calculation automatically for you. So it'll come back, recalculate the tooling being made in China, and then check to see how many tools would be required. So we've come back, we went from a 37-cent component to an 8-cent component. So all of this I've been doing one-off and individually, but the same steps I can go through. I can look at this part 100 different ways in what we call our matrix costing. I could take this part and cost this throughout 6, 12 regions of the world at different annual volumes and batch sizes. I have complete flexibility to do that. I also could take 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 components and analyze them in bulk, provided a Excel-based input to say, this is my material, this is my annual volume I'd like to analyze, and let aPriori run in the background. Regardless, once you've generated this data in aPriori, you can easily come through and analyze this at our reporting level. So to make it easy to understand trends within your data, parts that may be outliers, we have our cost insight reporting tool. So we support a range of dashboards and ad hoc views and reports. You'll see we have a starting point, but all of these can be customized to match the trends you're looking at. So just imagine that we took that component that we just costed and we costed it through 40 or 50 regions. We can easily see the cost implication of manufacturing in each specific region. So I took a similar part and ran it through, and I'm pulling in that data right now. So with this part, over on the left, you'll see we've costed it with aPriori Switzerland, $340, and then all the way over on the right, aPriori India at $53. So it's easy to generate a cost estimate for every single region for manufacturing, as well as additional parameters. Maybe you're looking at different materials throughout those regions. So with our cost insight reporting tool, you really can understand the trends within your data, understand the implications of sourcing based off of the actual CAD data, the geometry of the parts. So in addition to looking at components across regions, we can also look at trends within a group of components. So if we're looking to understand, for example, certain parts, and we're looking to see what we've been quoted back for a component. So we can analyze the aPriori cost versus our target cost versus what we've been quoted back. So imagine we're working on a new SUV model redesign. We're starting to go out and get quotes for this, and we can start to see where we're tracking. So the front seats, our current aPriori cost is $94. Our target cost is $117. So we're doing, really well as far as tracking the target. And then we have a quoted cost of $89. So we're even overachieving that aPriori estimated cost. So we got a very good cost for that component based off of looking at the sourcing through of that component globally. So With a priori and the cost insight reporting, it's really easy to understand trends within your data. So another important thing to touch on here as well is we're not only analyzing for cost, but every time we do a cost analysis, we're also taking that component and running a design to cost check or manufacturability check. So imagine that you have a group of sheet metal components that you're uh, tasked with sourcing. Uh, you may have a situation where you have components that are coming back with no bid, or they're coming back with really high cost because of manufacturing issues on those components. So imagine that the components are a group of sheet metal components, for example. I can run a report to understand if any of my components have manufacturing issues. So here I've run my report on a group of sheet metal parts. I can see that the vast majority of my components have no manufacturing issues, but some of them up here, for example, this first one, 16 proximity issues. If I come down, this part has 6 hole issues. I can really start to understand, what's driving either no quotes or what's driving high quoted costs. If I come down, I can actually see some of my sheet metal components have machining. So, a red flag is thrown here based off of the design. It could be that tolerance that's driving machining. It could be the geometry of the feature that's driving machining. We'll automatically capture the time and cost associated with those additional steps, as well as any of the implications of manufacturability. So with a priori and cost insight reporting, there are a wide range of ways to analyze your parts to understand trends within your data. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Nikita.
Thanks, Dan. All right, let me just share my screen again. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about implementing a priori. So let's first quickly look at the overall deployment approach. On this slide, you'll see an example of what an a priori sprint deployment approach could look like. We like to take a workshop-based approach that is targeted on specific commodities. The goal of this approach is really to ensure that you're getting value as quickly as possible in the deployment with a structured milestone approach. On the next couple of slides, I'll go through some of the specifics of what you can find in a sprint workshop, an applied services workshop, and in expert services. Keep in mind, though, we will work with you and your team on a very detailed level to create the right plan and approach for your specific goals. So we don't have a cookie cutter approach that we apply for all of the organizations that we work with. So what you're seeing is purely just an example of what is something that you could find in a deployment. So let's first look at a sprint workshop. A workshop like this will typically run about 3.5 days during a 1-week period. We will start off with a success workshop that would be run by a customer success manager like myself. During the success workshop, we'll talk about goals, metrics, and any other specific items that your organization is trying to accomplish. We will then go into your overall business processes to understand where a priori can be applied throughout the process in order to ensure that your users know when to use the tool and what group or what data will be needed by other groups in your organization. Next, we'll plan out a change management approach so that as you're implementing new software, you have a sound strategy to ensure change happens seamlessly. And lastly, we'll talk about an onboarding plan so that as new users are ramping up onto the software, they have the resources they need to really hit the ground running with the tool. The next 3 days are run by an implementation engineer. They will work with your users directly and perform a cost breakdown exercise and spend analytics on your specific parts. We'll also teach users skills like regional batch analysis and cost analysis exercises. And lastly, there's ample open use time so that as the users are using the tool, they can ask questions about what they're costing how they're costing through their parts, and ensure they have everything they need to start adding value with the tool. It's not uncommon to see that after one of these workshops, you'll have a good amount of data that can already be used within the sourcing use case. After the 1 week workshop, we often see buyers take the results of the workshop back to their supply base and start negotiating to get value as quickly as possible. The next type of workshop we offer is an applied services workshop for sourcing negotiation with aPriori. Before the training, our team will get a number of parts from your group and analyze and cost them to understand where there are potential outliers for renegotiation. During the training, we'll spend 2 days reviewing how fact-based negotiation works and prepare your buyers on how to negotiate on these specific outliers. We'll then make sure your team is prepared to ask the right questions to the suppliers and get realized savings. After the training, we'll help you revise any data that's needed for ongoing discussions and work with you on how to best capture any savings. We have seen these workshops be extremely impactful to customers that we work with, and oftentimes many get hard savings from the negotiations following the workshop. So lastly, we recommend that all customers get some level of expert services. Essentially, expert services are monthly hours that can be used at your disposal for a variety of activities that can be completed to help your overall deployment and achieve your goals. Our expert services consultants are able to provide mentoring and coaching. They will be able to work with your users and make sure you have all the support you need to make sure you're successfully completing cost estimates that are needed for your team. They can also perform use case specific activities. So for example, in sourcing, they can work with your group to do a spend analytics together. They can also work with your group on the overall sourcing process and making sure it's as streamlined as possible to make sure you're getting value from the tool. They also have a technical background, so they can make adjustments to your digital factory and create supplier specific digital factories, or even create custom and ad hoc reports so that you're not spending time manipulating the data out of the tool and really using it as quickly as possible. We see that our expert services customers actually are able to achieve 3 times the realized cost savings than customers that don't have expert services. So we see expert services is really kind of the number one way to make sure you're getting the value that you need. So with that, we are ready for any questions.
I don't see any questions that have come through the chat, but if you do have any specific questions you'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat window on costinsight.com, and we're happy to answer any questions. If you do have any questions after this, feel free to email either myself or Nikita with a question, or schedule a follow-on meeting, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation.
I also believe because this isn't a webinar, you can just also unmute and ask a question to us directly if that's easier.
Yeah, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So give 2 examples of where this would really work well, what industries and products, and then 2 examples of where this wouldn't work as well.
Okay, sure. So I guess from Dan, you can answer this from your perspective as well. I think industries that we see it work well. We see a lot in like heavy machinery, heavy equipment. Aerospace uses it very well within their specific parts. And it really, I think what the key is to making sure that aPriori is successful is understanding how your parts are manufactured and if they're manufactured in the ways that we offer simulation. I think that's really the key. And anytime you're really doing that, you can apply some of the practices we have. Where we don't see it maybe fitting as well is if you have like highly customized manufacturing processes, or really, high volumes where there's specific, like very specialized tooling, because aPriori can't like calculate those specific things. So any of our customers that have, volumes in the tens and hundreds of millions, we don't necessarily see that being a good fit, because at that point, volumes are so high that the manufacturing processes are, heavily customized. So I see that from my perspective. I guess, Dan, do you have anything else to add from your perspective?
Nope. Yeah, those were all very good points. I think the only other area that I've seen that's a challenge is when when you're trying to utilize should costs, but you don't actually control the intellectual property of your design. So if you just go out and contract with a company to engineer and design a specific part or assembly for you, that obviously becomes challenging as far as leveraging negotiation if you're not owning that intellectual property. So that's the only other area where I see potential challenges.
Great, thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it.
No problem.